If you remember last week, we were looking at an ordinary man with extraordinary accomplishments, talking about Elijah. We didn't finish that, but just in kind of review. If you remember, extraordinary means not out of the normal or ordinary, doing something that most of us wouldn't do. And I think it's interesting, how many of you want to be normal or how many of you want to be extraordinary? And I think it's an interesting question because a lot of people, they don't want to be extraordinary. It's an interesting question to ask. If you remember last week we looked at him being an ordinary man with extraordinary accomplishments, he had a nature like ours, you remember? He also was a righteous man, so he was right standing before God, and he also was a prayer warrior. He prayed fervently, prayed effectively. And if you remember then his conduct too, if you think about it, after he prayed for no rain, he went flying in the food. You remember the ravens brought it to him, scavengers bringing it twice a day. And as to what they brought him, we don't know. And staying there like he was told to, and didn't leave until the brook dried up. Still didn't leave until God told him to. And again, God then told him, then remember to go to Sidon, which would be the capital, or which would be where under the rule of Jezebel's dad, and they were Baal worshippers. And you think, how many of you would want to go to? Does it make sense to leave to go to Baal worshiping country to a widow who's likewise experiencing a famine? If anybody is going to have difficulty, it'd be a widow, and also being a Gentile. Again, an act of faith on her part and on his part. And then also, then when her child died, to have enough faith to pray that God restore him. How many of us would have that kind of faith? So that's a member. He's just an ordinary man, but he has great, extraordinary accomplishments because he walked by faith. Today I'd like for us to look at, we think about faith walking by fixing our eyes on him. Faith walking by fixing our eyes on him. We all walk by faith to some degree. If you don't believe it, what happens when you come up to a red light or a green light? You know, your light's green, what do? You go or you keep going. You're assuming the one on the other side of the red light's going to do what?
Stop.
And when it changes, what happens then, a lot of us then do faith plus work, faith plus sense. It turns green, but we do what? We look both ways because we've been around long enough, half of them don't stop. And I think we do a lot of that in our Christian life. We walk by faith part of the time, and we walk by senses part of the time. It's the same with brakes. You know, your brakes work, so you come speeding along and you are assuming the brakes work. If you knew they didn't work, how many of us would come up to the intersection as quickly as you do? You're making those statements. But we look at it, Proverbs 3 in verse 5 and 6, it tells us what? Trust in the Lord with what? And lean not in part of your ways. All your ways. Acknowledge him. He'll direct your path. So I think it's important to look at it. We look at Elijah then, whose faith walking by fixing our eyes on him. We have to come up with some definitions, which, by the way, I need to correct. This is a 10-foot ceiling. Gene pointed it out to me. That's a 6'6" doorway. That's a little more than 3 feet up there. So, but let's think about it. How do you define faith? I think Romans 4 in verse 11 defines it probably the best you find in Scripture, when it says, being fully assured that what he had promised he's able to perform. So put that even with Elijah. Being fully assured that it wasn't going to rain, he prayed accordingly, right? Being fully assured that it was going to rain, he did. So put anything that you're facing in that and see how much faith. Demonstrated is in Hebrews 11:5, and that would be, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. I think it's important to recognize that's a description of our faith. It's demanded in Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it's what? Impossible to please him. If that's the case, is he going to put each and every one of us in a place of walking by faith? And it's going to be a very long line. In Colossians 2, it also tells us, Paul says, as you've come to him by faith, so likewise walk in him by faith. So let's think about it. How is my Christian life viewed? If people or you are looking at your own Christian life, would you say you're faith walking? Or would you say you walk by faith and senses? Or would you say you walk strictly by senses? So today we're going to be looking at 1 Kings 18 and 19, and it's very, very well known. So A lot of you are going to wonder why. Look at something we all know. I think we can learn a lot from it. Faith walking by keeping our eyes on Him. And first of all, you have the challenge of the prophets and the people. And notice you find that in verse 1. You have the command in verse 1 and in verse 2. It came about after many days, it would be roughly 3 years, and the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show yourself to Ahab, and I'll send you rain on the face of the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Okay, what's the capital?
Samaria.
Why would it be more severe there than other places?
More people.
Who is the source, the leadership? And who's the one that brought Baal worship and everything here? And God is, it's severe here, so notice after 3 years, very severe. And notice, how would you like to be commanded to go see Ahab, who has been looking for you, trying to kill you for the last 3 years? You know, he's been wanting to kill you, so hey, what? And God's been hiding you. Now God says, go show yourself to the guy who wants to kill you. So notice then, starting in verse 3 down to through verse 6, you have the charge to Obadiah. There was a lack of water, obviously, and Ahab says, we don't want to lose the horses and stuff, so Ahab says, I'll go one way, and Obadiah, you go another way. And Obadiah was over the household, who was a believer. He says, you try to find water, and I'll try to find water, and whoever does will do it to try to save the animals. You find that in verse 5. Obadiah had just started on his way. In verse 7, you notice Elijah meets him and sees him. Now it's interesting when you think about the request then. What happens in verse 7, Elijah tells him in verse 8, in verse 9, basically, hey, I want to go meet your master. And Obadiah says, what sin have I committed? Because it's noticed why he makes that statement is because of verse 10 and verse 12. As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master is not sent searching for you. And when they said he's not here, he made that kingdom or nation swear that they could not find you. You go down to verse 12. And if they come about when I leave you, that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you when I do not know. When I come tell Ahab he cannot find you, he'll kill me, although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. So apparently when people did get close to Elijah in the last 3 years, what happened?
They were killed.
The Spirit took him, oh, he's not here, and he took him whatever. So obviously, you notice he's saying, we've looked everywhere, and if Ahab gets close, we're not going to, and then he's going to kill me, and man, I've done everything right. Why do I want to do this? And it's interesting. He then relates how he's fed 100 prophets, 50 in each cave, and Obadiah, notice you look down, and he tells him, in verse 15, Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, behold whom I stand, I will surely show myself today to him. So they had just started on their journey, because now Obadiah has to go find Ahab. So they can't be that far apart, just started looking for water. And so here he gets him, and Elijah's there. Notice what happens in 17 when you look at it. You're going to have the cause. And notice what happens in 17. It came about, and Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, is that you troubler of Israel? Ahab's blaming the trouble on who?
Elijah.
Because Elijah prayed for what?
No rain.
No rain. And it hasn't rained. So you're the problem. It's interesting how Elijah corrects him and responds. 18, this is how to win friends and influence people too. And he said, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you followed the Baals. It's plural because they had local deities too. But notice he makes the correction. No, the reason Israel's having a problem, and the reason you haven't had rain is not because of me. It's because of you leading the nation into sin. And our concept, what we do and our actions have a tremendous impact on others around us, whether it be a family or a nation or anything else. So he makes that correction. Now he has a challenge. And notice the challenge. Now then, send and gather to me all of Israel in Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Ashtaroth, so that's the male and the female deity, who eat at Jezebel's table. She's feeding how many?
800.
During a famine. You think about the cost and everything else. Notice, so Ahab sent a messenger among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together to Mount Carmel. So notice then, that's why I said 3 years. When you get to James, it's 3.5 years. It's going to take a while for the people, for the challenge to go out, for the prophets to get there, for all of Israel to get there, to go from Samaria all the way to Mount Carmel, to the mountain range. So notice then what happens when they get there. How would you like to be Elijah right now? He has a nature like ours. And how many are going? 850, or potentially 850. Jezebel keeps 450 back, only the Baal prophets go. And notice though, you have, how would you like to be? 1 versus 400. How many of you would wonder, did I really hear God right? Well, we laugh, but how many of us, when God speaks to us, do we then all of a sudden, did I really hear Him? I think a lot of us do a lot more like Gideon, really. Well, notice then, he also sends them, and notice the question, why they're gathered there is in verse 21. Elijah came near to all and says, how long, talk to the people, how long will you hesitate between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow Him, but if Baal, follow him. And the people did not answer him. In other words, they're straddling the fence. You and I can do the same according to what you find in the last verse of 1 John. Little children, believers, don't follow after what? Idols. You're also told not to have spiritual adultery. So here you have it. There's the challenge that goes out. And when Elijah says in verse 22, I alone am left, you remember he knows there's 100 prophets alone that Obadiah had spared, but he's the only one who's representing God in this challenge. There's others, but he's the only one that's up there. And notice then what he does, the challenge that he has then, he says, you give 450 prophets show up in 22. People are there, so is Ahab. So there's 2 oxen, you prepare. Now why do you think he said for them to go first? You ever wonder? Why would he want them to go first? Why didn't he just go first?
He knew they'd fail.
Okay. If he knows they aren't going to be able to call it down, then it's going to make it that much more obvious. Also, who got to choose the animal first? So they could have said, well, you got the better animal. You choose the one you want, and you go first. You'll notice it started at 9 in the minute. And by the way, notice in verse 24, whoever can call it down, fire, that's the God we need to serve. And the people said, yes, that's right. All right, the challenge is out. So it starts then in verse 25. It starts in the morning, roughly 9, and they go all morning long. In verse 26, and nothing happens. 27, it's now noon, and Elijah starts to mock him. It's interesting when you look at it. He says, call out with a loud voice, for he is God. Either he is occupied, which means he's talking. He can't hear more than one of you. Now, that's quite a slap when you think that God can hear how many of us? All right, he's gone aside. That's the word for going to the bathroom. Or he is on a journey, which means he's out hunting. Being very sarcastic, and obviously God can be our God. We know He can be anywhere and everywhere, and He hears anyone and everyone at all times. Or maybe He's asleep. Does our God sleep? So notice they cry and they continue to cut themselves with lances and swords till they are bleeding profusely. And they do it from midday until the evening sacrifice, 3 o'clock. So they did it for how long?
3 hours.
They went from 9 to noon, and from noon to 3. What happened? Was it pretty obvious?
Yes.
Pretty obvious. We gave him plenty of time. Alrighty, so now it's Elijah's time. And I want you to think about it when you look at it, but notice he starts in verse 30, and I think it's interesting. Now Elijah, come near to me, so all the people came near. Notice in verse 31 and 32, the sad thing, he first has to repair the altar. Should he have to repair the altar if they're serving the Lord?
No.
That altar should be in use. It's also interesting, he does 12 stones. For what reason?
Because the 12 tribes of Israel.
But this is the northern 10. Judah's on the southern, but there's still 12 tribes. And it's interesting, Elijah recognizes it's still 12 tribes. You might have separated because of, but they shouldn't have. And obviously they have a false religion in Samaria. But he repairs it. And then notice then what happens is obviously he prepares the ox. And then he starts pouring water on it. How many times does he pour water on it? 3 times. Where'd they get the water? You know, was it, you know, they're in the, up, you know, in the mountain range. Obviously there could be a spring, there could be, you know, but again, it's going to take time. Why would he want water on it?
To make it more difficult for fire.
More difficult. If you haven't had rain for 3.5 years and you have dry wood, you know, people say, well, you can rub the wood together and you have friction, you can start. He wants to make sure that people recognize wood. There is no way this is going to start without a miracle. And there's enough water, you'll see that it fills the trenches were full of water too. So we're talking about a large quantity of water that was put on it. Time of the evening sacrifice. And it's interesting what happens then. Notice what he has some requests. Notice in verse 36. And it came by the time of the evening offering that Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Israel, today let it be known that thou art the God of Israel. By the way, you notice again, it's not was. They're still living. That's how Jesus proves the resurrection in Matthew 22. Notice the second thing he wants them to do, the second request. By the way, he's praying, and he's praying how? Out loud. He wants the people to hear the prayer of what he's doing. Second thing, and I am thy servant. I have done all these things according to thy word. I prayed that there wouldn't be rain. Why? Because you told me to. I'm making this challenge because you told me to. It's not, he's bringing glory to whom? Not to himself. Important to recognize. Notice the third thing in 20 and 37. Answer me, O Lord, answer me that this people may know that thou, O Lord, art God, and thou hast turned their hearts back again. I want them to know that you are the God of Israel. I want them to know that I am your prophet, and I want to turn them back to you. And he prays out loud for all this to take place. How much of a fervent prayer would you be praying right now? Is your reputation at stake? Who's the one that made the challenge? Okay, we all know what happens then. Obviously in 38, fire comes down from heaven and burns it all up, including the water and everything. I mean, it just, you know, it wasn't just a little bit of fire. I mean, it was scorching. And notice then what the people, they fall on their face and said, Lord, he is God, and Lord, he is God. Okay. They made a faith statement, didn't they? You say that Lord is God, according to Deuteronomy 13. If the Lord is God, what are you as a people in the Old Testament supposed to do with false prophets?
Kill them.
Kill them. They have made their statement and it's shown they're false. Elijah's made the statement and shown it, and God has made the statement. That's why you'll notice in verse 40, they seized them and they kill all 450 prophets. Because they're leading the people astray. So it's interesting when you look at that, when you stop and you think about it, like Elijah, do I tell what God tells me to for the purpose of pointing people to God? Can you tell what God says but to point people to yourself? You can. Can you speak and do everything but bring glory to yourself? Elijah was speaking for God, but he wanted everybody's eyes on who? On God, not on him. The second thing, am I willing to stand alone when the really majority are on the other side? We're getting that place in our country today. So here you have this, obviously the great challenge, and they put him to death. Now he's going to challenge Ahab. You notice in verse 41, you have a prophecy. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up and eat and drink, for there is the sound of a roar of heavy shower." Okay, how do you know when there's a sound of roar of heavy shower?
Thunder.
Pardon?
Thunder.
Thunder? Okay. How many clouds are in the sky? Not one. So let's just pretend. You guys need to hurry up and eat and get your strength, because we're about to have a heavy thunderstorm. And what would you look at me and what would you say? You're crazy. But did God say he was bringing the rain? So on faith, he's making this statement, and he's telling him, and by the way, it's interesting, Ahab believes him. Because Ahab goes ahead and eats and everything else. But there's not a cloud, it's clear. So what are you going to do if you are Elijah? It's interesting, you notice, he goes up to the top of Mount Carmel, so obviously the sacrifice is not at the top. He crouches down and he starts to pray. And after he prays one time, he tells his servant to go look. Which, by the way, his servant wasn't with him earlier, but he is now. I often wonder who that servant is. I don't know. Was it Obadiah? I don't know. But notice, each time he comes back and he says what? So after second time, third time, fourth time, sixth time, what do you do? If you're Elijah, what do? You keep praying. Notice on the seventh one, he prays, and notice in verse 44 it says, "Behold, a cloud as small as the man's hand is coming up from the sea." That'd be the Mediterranean Sea, and that's where the storm would come from. A little bitty cloud coming up, and he says, "Go to Ahab and tell him what? Prepare your chariot and go down so the heavy shower doesn't stop you." You see a little cloud coming up, and I'm saying, you guys, Don, you live in Tulsa, you better get going. That's a bad storm coming. And you're going to see a little cloud and go, what? That little thing? What does Ahab do? He takes off. They're going to Jezreel. How far is Jezreel from Mount Carmel? Anywhere from 17 to 25 miles, depending on the mountain range. What kind of horses do you think the king is going to have?
The best.
The best. He's going to have good horses. So notice in 45, it came out in a little while that the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. He's going, he's taking off. Notice the miracle. Then the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to Jezreel. People want to know the fastest marathon ever run is right here. You think about it. How old is he? It doesn't matter how old he is. I don't care any track star. If you're going on the mountains and you're going to go that far, you are not going to beat horses for that length of time. And Elijah wasn't one that was out training to run. Why did God, by the way, who wanted Elijah at Jezreel? That's critical. God wanted Elijah at Jezreel. Who is at Jezreel? Jezebel. That's important to remember about what's about to take place. So you think about it, here you have it. Do I believe God's promises and lay my reputation on it? Am I earnest and fervent and believing in prayer? To have a servant. What about your kids and your grandkids? You still to pray. You earnestly believe and tell them, hey, check. They check. It's going to come. It's going to happen. Notice then the faithless walking that's going to now happen by keeping our eyes on ourselves and our circumstances. Elijah had these great victories. And personally, I find often after some great victories in your life, be careful, because so often there's valleys right around the corner. But notice what happens in verse 1. Ahab, chapter 19, tells Jezreel all that Elijah had done and how he killed the prophets. So he's retelling the story. Response of Jezebel, she sends a messenger to Elijah. So notice he's still there. So may the gods do to me, and even more, if I don't make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow, about this time. By tomorrow, you're dead. Who brought you here? All these 3.5 years was Elijah done everything that God told him to do.
Yes.
Okay? Now she says she's going to kill him. What should you do? Has God told you to leave? Has God told you to run? So notice then what takes place in verse 3. You'll notice then in verse 4, he was afraid, which, by the way, he told the woman in chapter 17, make the meal, don't be afraid, make the meal for me first. God will provide. But notice then, he is afraid, and he runs for his life. And he goes to Judah, and he leaves his servant there. Why would he go to Judah? Obviously part of it is because of a different king, and he's wanting to get away. But needless to say, was he told to run? No. His eyes were on what? The situation, and he knows Jezebel is a real threat, and he knows she will do it. So his eyes are on his circumstances and on people and not on God. All the way up to this time, he was on God. By the way, that can be for all of us. You can be following the Lord greatly, and you can turn at any time to look at circumstances. And we can do vice versa as well. So notice then, the restoration. It's amazing what God does here. Notice in verse 4, he gets down there and he tells the Lord in verse 4, it's enough now, O Lord, take my life, I'm no better than my father. You know? But how many of us have pity parties? No, seriously. How many of us have pity parties? You know, she's going to kill. I'm out. You know, the fathers are dead, and they didn't have success, and she's going to kill me, and I'm just. It's all over. And notice then what happens. He lies down, he falls asleep, and what does God through an angel do? The angel probably obviously came in the form of man, more than likely. He says, "Rise and eat," and he has bread and he on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate, he slept, and went back to sleep. A second time in verse 7. He's told to do the same thing. Does God scold him right away? No. It's amazing. He provides for him and the rest. Now, where does God want to take him in verse 8? He wants to take him to Horeb, the mountain of God. Where is Horeb from where he's at? 200 miles. And why would he want him to go to Horeb? What happened at Horeb? In history, Old Testament history, what happened? Did Moses do a few things down there? You see it in Exodus chapter 19. So notice then, he's told to go, and he gets there. 40 days, it'd actually be about a 14-day journey if he went straight, but obviously he's wandering, he's hiding back and forth. It takes him 40 days. It's also interesting that God provided for him for the strength. I often wonder, even yesterday I was thinking, what did he eat that gave him enough strength for 40 days? I don't know, but God gave him whatever he needed and sustained him. Now when he gets there, in verse 9, which by the way you have to give him credit, he was obedient, he went, didn't he? And then you'll notice he went, and now the question is asked when he's in the cave, what are you doing here, Elijah? Well, who told him to go there? It's an interesting question. Now he's told, and of course he then tells him that I'm the only one left and they're trying to kill him. And notice verse 11, so he said, go forth and stand on the mountain. So he leaves the cave and goes to the mountain. In verse 11 and verse 12, God shows some different things. You'll notice you'll have the wind great enough to break rocks. You have an earthquake. You have fire. That's the same thing that happened in Exodus 19 with Moses. So if God could do it in Exodus 19, Elijah, can he do it today? Is God the same yesterday, today, and forever? Yes. But it's interesting, God does not show himself there. I am still the same, but I don't necessarily lead and do everything the same. How important is that for you and I to get? He may have led one person one way. He's still the same God, but he won't necessarily lead you the same way. Notice then what happens in verse 19. And it came about when Elijah heard it, talking about the gentle blowing, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of what? Oh, now he's back in the cave. So when he was out on the mountaintop, God shows him the different things that he's capable of. He's now returned to the cave, and he hears the gentle. And notice again the question, what are you doing here, Elijah? And notice he then relates again the story, I alone am left, they're sick in my life. Now it's interesting what happens then. God now tells him what? From 15 down to 18, he tells him, I want you to go back. And I want you to anoint 3 people. He's going to have a foreign king he's going to anoint. He's going to have Jehu who he's going to anoint. And he's going to have Elisha who he's going to anoint. God's plan to take care of the rest of Ahab and Jezebel was not through Elijah, but through others. How many times are we buying off stuff we shouldn't be? My job is to walk by faith. God has a plan, and he'll deal with it. And by the way, he does start walking by faith again, and he does this. God gently pointed it to him, fed him, but he wanted to show, I'm still the same. But I do things differently, and you've done your job, and it's Elisha, and it's going to be Jehu, and so on. So let's think about it, just in closing. Does God still have a plan for you if you've blown it? Thank God he does, right? Return to him and start walking by faith again. And by the way, God's plan may be using others. A lot of times, you've done your part, let others do their part. Think also, do I believe God's promises and lay my reputation on them? How many of us pray earnestly, believing, truly believing that God can do whatever he says he can do? And, we look at all the different things. Most of the time we walk by faith. Or excuse me, by sight. Sad to say. Most of the time.